Bitter. Okay, so we are in our Christmas season, and what better thing to talk about than the idea of hope? And so we're going to spend the next couple weeks talking about the idea of hope. Classic, right? Classic Christmas series of what should we talk about? Well, we could talk about joy, right? Or peace, or hope, right? These are the ones that we often talk about. And so for me, typically, I'm going to this maybe sermon this morning is more, let me give you the background of lesson planning for me, or preaching planning, of what does that look like. And so I start going through the Bible. I start reading all these different verses on hope, on how we have this great hope in God, things that are hoped for. And as I'm going through it, I come to one spot at the end of Luke. It's the road to Emmaus, if you remember this story. It's actually after the resurrection of Jesus. Two of his disciples are essentially walking on this road. They meet the risen Jesus, and they're talking to him, and they don't know who he is. And then at one point, they're explaining what has happened. They're like, how do you not know about what's been going on? And so they tell him, yeah, there's this guy Jesus. He was a great prophet, a man of God, and all of these things. But he's been crucified. And then they say this line, almost like despair. They said, "But we had hoped that he was the Redeemer of Israel." And that's where I got stuck at the beginning, kind of as I was prepping for this. But we had hoped. And I was thinking about that line, about how often we hope for things. We expect things. We desire for things. And then they don't happen. I don't know if you're like that, but there are things in my life that I had hoped for. I had put my hope in. And then it seemed like it had failed. And that statement, "but we had hoped," just really resonated with me. And so I started thinking about, man, what is it that takes our hope? What is it that maybe squashes our hope, extinguishes our hope? Because hope, yeah, in a Christmas season, it's like new. As a kid, you hoped for gifts. Maybe, there's this new hope as Christmas hits, and then the new year. But for some of you, Christmas is actually a really hard season. Because while people are having this great Christmas fun with family and friends, maybe for some of you, you are in a season that you're really struggling in. And Christmas ends up feeling like it puts a magnifying glass on that sometimes. That, man, in my life right now, there are places, or maybe just in totality, that I feel very hopeless. And so what do I do with that? What do I do when I feel hopeless or without hope? And so with that kind of in mind, I'm thinking through, stories in the Bible. And then I started thinking through movies. And that's kind of a dangerous thing, because then I'm YouTubing videos, and 3 hours later, I'm like, none of these work, but I had a great time watching them. But actually the one that stood out to me of an idea of kind of hopelessness, and then hope arrive, or coming at the last minute, was The Lord of the Rings. And so I'm not a huge fan I'm a fan, but I'm not like a fanatic. So I might get something wrong. John already told me he'll yell no if I say something wrong. But in The Lord of the Rings, the second book, The Two Towers, the group is split up. If you don't know the story, hopefully you know the story, right? There's this fellowship of people. How many guys? I don't remember. Somebody's leaning, saying it's 7, it's 9, whatever the number is. They're off to destroy this ring that will keep the evil wizard from power. Close enough, John? Okay, great. I'm really just talking to John right now and making sure that I'm okay. And so, they're battling. There's all of these different battles. The whole series, though, is all these times where you feel like the group, the good guys, at all these different points are going to be destroyed. It's all lost. And then yet something happens and it like rekindles the hope. And I think the one for me that instantaneously hit in my mind was the second book, The Two Towers. They are in this fortress, this castle at Helm's Deep. It's in this valley and this mountain behind it. And it's this place that is, can stand against the enemy. But the enemy comes against the fortress and they are beating it down. They are going to overtake it. And the king and some of the fellowship are there and they're going like, they're gonna invade the castle. We're gonna be done. And they come together and they're like, hey, we're going to have like one last ride. Like, let's go out. Like one last charge of glory. I remember the scene in the movie is Aragon, which is who's going to become the king. He sees through the light of like this window, kind of like dawn rising up. And he remembers Gandalf, who's the wizard, kind of often the Christ-like figure in this. And he says, hey, I'm going to get help. And look for me in the east on the 5th day when the sun comes up. And so as they go out into battle, this is kind of like just a picture of the battle of the city, the siege. But in the movie, in the book then, go to that second picture here, you have Gandalf just leading this massive army down the hill as kind of the light of dawn comes over. And what was darkness, what was despair, what was hopelessness in the movie, all of a sudden gets pierced by the light. And they're going to be saved. And so as they kind of ride out on this huge bridge, Gandalf is coming on the other side, and they're able to defeat, at least for the time, the army against them. And so I laughed as I came in this morning, this idea of light and darkness. It's like, man, this guy, you're just giving me this great illustration, right on the day I'm preaching this, as I'm in the basement, this dark basement, and like, I'm like, what am I? I'm not an electrician. Like, I don't know what to do. Like, I'm a pastor. I know how to teach the Bible, and that's about it. Like, ask Melissa how great I am at doing handy things around the house. I'm not. I can study well. I can speak well. I just talk the whole time. My dad ever tried to teach me anything. And it's just funny. I'm sitting in darkness in the basement, and I'm like depressed. I'm not at the point of hopelessness, but we can get there in our lives, right? And maybe you've been in a season. I know I've been in seasons where it does feel like darkness is all around me. Like, when is the daylight going to break? When is the sun going to shine? And you actually see this throughout Scripture when you start talking about, especially at this time of year, many of you know this passage, but as Jesus in Matthew kind of goes out into his ministry, what does it say? It says, the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. And for those dwelling in the regions of the shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. This idea of darkness and hopelessness, but there is light. As Jesus comes, there is light. This is said again in the gospel where we see the story of John the Baptist being born. If you remember the story, Zechariah is a priest. His wife, Elizabeth, they have no children. They are barren. An angel comes to Zechariah while he's in the temple to say, hey, you are going to have a child that is going to prepare the way for the one who will redeem Israel. And Zechariah can't really believe this. He is then made mute by the angel for some of his unbelief until the child is born. When the child is born, they name him John. And at this point, Zechariah's mouth, it says, is opened, and he starts to prophesy about his son and about the one who is to come. Here's what he says in Luke 1:78 and 79. Because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadows of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. There's this idea that as Jesus comes, he brings light. And they both, Luke and Matthew, both pick up on this. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, like where are they pulling this from? Like, why is this the imagery that we're supposed to resonate with? Why is it, I don't know about you, I grew up in the church, I've heard about like this great light all the time, right? I've heard that over and over and over. Well, when you start to look back into the Old Testament, here is where they're picking this up on. Let me share one verse, and then we'll go into another one even longer. This is Isaiah 59:9. It says this, "So justice is far from us, and the righteous do not reach us. We look for light, but all in darkness, for brightness, but we walk in the deep shadows." At this point of Israel's history, Israel has come into this promised land that was supposed to be flowing with milk and honey. We remember this. Think of the timeline. Slaves in Egypt, through the desert, 40 years of wandering, finally coming into the land of Canaan, fighting, battling, God prevailing, giving them the land, and yet still not really following him. The Israelites weren't. And so there's periods of where they push away from God and neighboring countries kind of invade. Then there's times where they come back and worship him. And then at one point they go, hey, we want a king. So we get King Saul, and then we get King David. And as time goes by, the people's hearts are still far from God. And they still abandon the God that they are supposed to be worshiping and following for other gods, for other things. And eventually the prophets, which so many of us, we kind of like blow by the prophets because their prophecies are hard to understand. Sometimes they don't feel applicable to our lives. Like, let me just read the New Testament. I like those books better than like, what am I supposed to do with Amos? Like, I don't know what to do with this book. But as the prophets come, they start to warn the people, hey, God is going to bring judgment. Like, you need to return to God. And yet over and over, their plea to return to God, the Israelites don't. And so eventually, Israel is captured. First by the Assyrians, and then by the Babylonians. This is where we get like the book of Daniel, right? Remember Daniel and the lion's den? You all learned that in Sunday school class. This is where the Babylonians come and they take people out of the city. Because this was a common tactic, right? To kind of keep their power, taking people out, especially the young, educating them under the Babylonian ideas and rule. And this is what they do with Daniel. And so they take him out. Then we get, though, in like the books of like Nehemiah, we get now God letting some of the people return back to Israel to rebuild Jerusalem. But that doesn't completely even go as planned. And so a lot of our prophets speak about this destruction that's going to come through the hands of the Assyrians or the Babylonians. And we have Isaiah talking about it. And then we have a guy named Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a depressing figure. Depressing. Like, he talks about the destruction of Israel. And then we get this book of Lamentations. Many people believe that Jeremiah writes the book of Lamentations. It's a poem that's written, and each chapter in your Bible, and we can't really see this, is a poem that essentially goes through A through Z through the Hebrew alphabet. And it's miserable. It's talking about literally the time as the Babylonians come in, siege the city, burn the temple, steal my children, and literally wipe them out. It's depressing to read it. And he goes over, and in fact, there's parts of it where it's talking about like parents are eating their children, and whether that's a metaphor for what is actually happening or whether that is actually happening, either way, that's getting pretty bad. Can we agree? To the point where you're eating your own children because of what's happening, whether it's starvation or it's a metaphor of just death and misery and hopelessness. Great Christmas sermon, Steve. I told my buddies, we're all talking about, hey, what's your sermon series on for Christmas? Because I got a bunch of pastor friends, go figure. And I was like, oh, this week I'm talking about Lamentations 3. They're like, what are you doing, Steve? Like, this is not what you talk about at Christmas time. I'm like, yeah, but it sets everything up so great. At least in my mind, it does. Okay, so Lamentations 3 now, whether it's Jeremiah or another figure who writes this, again, to me, it doesn't really matter. He starts to take the perspective of like a singular person and how bad his life is and how miserable it is and how there's punishment from God because of their sin and what's happening. So let me read for you, not all of it, it's really long, but I'll read to you some of the stanzas of this. So each 3 verses is connected to a different letter of the alphabet in your mind. You can think of that, of them going, let me tell you how bad life is from A to Z. Lamentations 3, 1 through 3. I am the man who's been afflicted under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me to dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. Let me stop there and just hit on those 2 things again. Okay, you already picked it up, right? I don't even need to mention. We have the prophets throughout the book or throughout our Old Testament as they are far from God and God is letting them suffer the consequences of them rebelling against him. The imagery over and over is that I am in darkness, that darkness is overwhelming me, that there is no light. To talk about this idea when I'm far from God, that I am in darkness. It is as though I'm like dead. I'm in darkness and there is no light. This is done over and over, but especially here then in Lamentations. Okay, go on, 7 through 9. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. And he's blocked my ways with blocks of stone. He has made my path crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He turned aside my steps and tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He has bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. Do you feel the lowness of this? Right? Can you imagine if you were going to read your, maybe you found a diary of someone, maybe your spouse or your child, or maybe someone found your diary, and this is what they find written in it? I'd be calling prevention hotlines. They are so hopeless right now. I'm wasting away. My paths are crooked. I'm walled in. I'm heavy chained. I'm in darkness. He continues in 13. He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. Really quick there, kidneys were considered the place of emotion. It actually would be better rendered for our understanding of actual heart. Like when we say like you broke my heart, we're not talking about a literal heart. We're talking about the place that we would associate with our emotions and feelings. So kidneys are the same organ that they would use in Hebrew to describe that. And in fact, then when we get heart translated, that's often better translated as your mind, because when we think of a mind, we think of the whole person, right? Who they are, their mind. But kidneys were often related to this emotional place. And so that he's broken my heart. It's in pieces. I've become the laughing stock of all people, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has seated me with wormwood. 16, he has made my teeth grind on gravel. you ever eat something and have a little dirt in there? A little sand at the beach. You bite into your sandwich that you think is going to taste so well, but somehow the kids kicked sand in it. And it's the worst. I should have brought some sand and just had everybody put a little in their mouth. That would have been great. Grind my teeth on gravel. Made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. Look what he says here. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. If Jeremiah is the writer of this, as he sees his city being burned, as he sees the temple, the very temple where the presence of God is supposed to rest, destroyed and broken and pillaged, as he sees family members killed, children taken away, taken into captivity, women and children, you can see where he gets to the place where he says, I have no peace. I have no hope. It's gone. It's done. I resonate with that. I resonate with the place that sometimes I look at areas of my life and I say, it's hopeless. There's no good solution. Nothing's good's going to come out of this. I don't know if you've ever got there before. And maybe it's with a job. Maybe it's with family. It's just with relationships with friends or your life situation that you get to the place that the writer of Lamentations is at. I feel hopeless. I feel hopeless. It's done. Like I can't do it anymore. I can't go on. But then, this is the only place in all of Lamentations, so 5 chapters. He then pivots for a few. He makes a turn. He says, I'm hopeless in one stanza, and then he turns, and here's the turn in 19 and 21. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall, talking just about this idea of bitterness and misery. He says, my soul continually remembers it, and it is bowed down with me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. So what he's going to call to mind is not what we just read, but what is going to come. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. And so he's sitting in a place of bitterness, despair, and hopelessness. And then he pivots and he said, this is what I'm going to remember. And I'm going to have hope because of this. 22 through 24. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. He starts to remember. He says, here is what I'm going to remember. Here is what I'm going to focus on. And because I'm going to call this to mind, therefore I am going to have hope, even though I feel as though all hopelessness is all around me. Hope is gone. No. I can have hope because this is what I'll remember. I'm going to remember a couple of things about God. This is, if you remember a couple months ago as I first got here, and I was giving some of the verses that are most meaningful to me. I read you out of Exodus 34 as God comes before Moses and he gives him his name. And he says, I'm the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, right? Slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness to thousands of generations. This is what he calls back to mind. He says, I'm going to remember this about God, that his steadfast love never ceases. This is the idea of a covenant love, of a love that has obligation, that a love that despite time, despite circumstances, it's going to come through. He says, I'm going to remember this, that the steadfast love of God, it says, is for thousands of generations. It never ceases. It doesn't finish. He says his mercies never come to an end. His mercies never come to an end. His compassion, again, these are all the same words that God had told Moses, this is who I am. And now we have in Lamentation, the writer who is in complete despair. Everything in my life is ruined. I see death all around me. It's hopeless. But this I will remember, that who is my God? What is he like? This is why there's one writer who says the most important thing about you is what you believe to be true about God, because it changes your perspective on everything. So if I believe God is faithful forever, thus when I'm in my hopelessness, he is still faithful to me. He has mercy. This is the compassion. The root word of this comes from a mother's womb. The idea, right, of a mother's love for her child. It's an emotional word that it isn't going to end. It isn't going to fail. They're new every morning. And I like that idea. New can mean brand new, can also mean fresh. I love that as I studied that and go like fresh. I love, you ever lay down in your bed, you get fresh sheets and it smells nice? You ever have a kid that's normally stinking from basketball practice, take a shower and come sit next to you? I'm like, oh, you smell so good. You smell fresh. How about if for you cooks, because I'm always cooking, and you get fresh produce, produce that's hasn't been sitting in the back of your fridge for 2 weeks, starting to grow a little mold. You know what I'm talking about? The apple that's like withered, and you take a bite, you're like, oh, this is terrible. But when you get a fresh apple, go to the orchard and you bite, and it's that crisp, the sweetness of it. He says, these mercies are new every morning. They're fresh. As the light comes, it's the idea that this new day awakes, that they are going to keep coming. Faithfulness is an idea of firm or steady. He says, great is your faithfulness, your steadiness, your trustworthiness, and really kind of the linchpin of what we're talking about. If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, right? Like I've heard that over and over in my mind, then what is God like yesterday is super important for my today. Do you get this? So learning about God's faithfulness to the people of Israel is not just a history lesson. It's defining who God is. And if he stays like the same today, then when my life feels hopeless, when I am struggling, he doesn't change. He's consistent. He says then that the Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is my portion. Portion goes back to this idea of ownership. This was talked often about when you read about this, that what you ate was your portion. We see this in Scripture. The land that was given to different tribes of Israel was their portion, that it was their ownership, right? They owned that land, or that food was theirs. They took it. When during a sacrifice, what portions went to each person. And so when he says portion, he means this is yours. It's yours. Think about that then. The Lord is my portion. And who is the Lord? He is steadfast in his love. He is faithful and he is compassionate. Those things are mine through Jesus because I am gifted them. The Lord is my portion, and because of that, therefore, I will have hope in him. This is why then, as they talk about Jesus, it's so profound that they start hitting on these ideas that, hey, we are once in darkness, because that's where the people of Israel felt as a community, they were there. Their city had been destroyed. They continued to wait for this new king that was going to come from the line of David, the tribe of Judah, the lion that is going to come and to conquer. And they wait and they wait. And even when they're brought back into the city, they're still waiting for this. And hundreds of years go by and they wait and they wait and they wait. And then what the writers of the gospel start to show us is that Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise. That Jesus is what you have been hoping for all of these years. What your grandfather and your grandmother and your great-grandfather and your great-grandmother and the great and the great and the great before, they were all waiting. And while we sat in darkness, a light has come. A dawn has broke. This to me now all of a sudden, as I even was listening to Christmas carols, right? And we sing "O Holy Night," and the line of there is the thrill of hope. I'm thinking, yeah, it's because the people of Israel were hopeless. At the point Jesus comes, they're taken over by the Roman Empire, right? It's just one empire over another that's been taken over. And they are looking for someone to redeem them. And the reason they can have hope is that God is faithful. He has covenant love. He has compassion on us, and he doesn't change. Psalms 42:5 says it this way: "Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God." Maybe spend a second here just thinking about that. Scott, if you want to come up and we're going to close here. When you get into a season of like hopelessness, and maybe you want to even go, I'm pretty optimistic. Hopelessness is like, I don't know if I'd ever use the word hopelessness. But then as I think back on situations, I'm like, no, that's pretty hopeless. I was in that space. And my soul isn't right. It's like, I want to say crooked because that sounds, it's like sinful, but it's not in a good place with my faith. I'm not trusting in God. And so maybe even as we go to a season which should be joy and peace and hope, maybe ask yourself, as the psalmist does here, like, why? Why am I so downcast? Are there areas in my life that I have lost hope in God and what he can do? Hope in a good God who is faithful and just. Hope for a good God who works all things out for the good of those who love him, right? Hope for a good God who redeems and forgives people. Like the question is like, is there areas that I've lost hope in? And why? Because if I really do believe in the God that is in the Bible and in this Old Testament that is faithful, then I see Jesus as, man, just the fulfillment of so many promises, both to the Israel in the past, but also to me, like right now, that he's my portion. So I'm going to give you a minute, and maybe just pray, and maybe you need to talk to somebody next to you and just go, hey, would you pray? Like, this is an area I need hope in. I need God as my portion in my life. And maybe if you're not there and you're like, no, I got tons of hope. That's awesome. Maybe there's people in your life that are in that spot of despair, in that spot of darkness, feeling like I'm waiting for the sunrise and it's not there yet. And so would you ask God, who hears all things, who is good, to shine his light on them, to reveal Jesus to them through the power of his Spirit in their life? So, can you take a minute just where you are, and would you spend time praying to God, asking him to either show you hope or maybe to someone else, because he is faithful to do so?